Well, hi, everybody. I'm Don Stewart, and welcome to another edition of Breaking News for this Tuesday. It's the 20th day of August, 2024. And again, since we met you last time, some really interesting stories have come across the wire, stories we need to know about that continue to confirm what the Bible says our world's going to look like at the time of the end of this age before the second coming of Christ and all the predicted events preceding it. All right, what do we have? Well, we find out last night in Biden's last major speech, it really sums up his ultimate feelings towards Israel. He really doesn't care about them. And to make that clear, Anthony Blinken said today that the U.S. won't accept a long-term occupation in Gaza. Now, supposedly, some of Israel's negotiators are upset with Netanyahu's hard line. Interesting, the comments in the section can't believe they would be, but we'll talk about that. An opinion piece by Michael Orin, former ambassador, urges that the hardline approach is all that will win over Hamas. And finally, Israel's north today has already seen over 135 rockets since this morning. Remember, they're still not at war. 135 rockets just today have come from Hezbollah to northern Israel. So let's get to the stories. First of all, headline we have Biden says pro-Hamas protesters outside the DNC have a point. And he never mentions Israel. Again, he's at the Democratic National Convention. He spoke last night. They gave him the midnight shift, actually. They pushed him out where he was finishing after midnight on the East Coast. But anyway, be that as it may, he said the protesters outside, the pro-Palestinian protesters on the street, actually, which includes supporters of Hamas and who shouted anti-Semitic slogans as they're protesting, actually have a point. As Breitbart News reported, thousands of pro-Palestinians protested, rallied, and marched near the convention at the United Center there in Chicago. Some waved Hamas flags, many chanted slogans calling for the total destruction of Israel, and said Zionists, meaning the majority of the Jews, were not welcome in their procession or in the city of Chicago itself. One protester wore a swastika. Many chanted against Biden, Vice President Harris, and the Democrats. Now, Biden never once mentioned the word Israel when he was talking about these protests, but he talked about the Palestinians and empathized with the protests. He claimed falsely to have written a peace treaty to end the ongoing war in Gaza. In fact, Hamas has never agreed to peace with Israel, has merely considered releasing some Israeli hostages if Israel agrees to stop fighting back. So it was typical of Joe Biden's career with respect to Israel. He's not been a friend to Israel. He really hasn't been since October 7th. He's done a few things that would seemingly what he had to do being the United States president, but he really hadn't gone out of his way. And his real feelings basically showed up. If he was a genuine president that really supported Israel, he wouldn't have said that these protesters have a point. They have no point whatsoever. When you listen to what they say, they're paid protesters by Iran. We know that. That was been made aware to the world months ago. I guess he didn't get the memo, as Iran is behind all these protests and these groups and with the financing and the such like. Anyway, it's fitting ending to who he is. He was telling a bunch of lies, yelling and screaming last night. Looked like a tired, angry old man. And so this seems to be his last major speech he will give, or any speech that anybody will pay attention to. So that was that. Now, here's a terrible story. Now, this one just came over the wire right before I started to record. Anthony Blinken says the U.S. won't accept a long-term occupation of Gaza. U.S. Secretary of State speaks in Doha, says the Gaza ceasefire deal needs to get done in the coming days, and the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar will do everything possible to get Hamas on board. Good luck on that. Speaking to reporters in Doha, Blinken said the United States, Egypt, and Qatar will do everything possible to get them on board with their bridging proposal. He added that once Hamas agrees to the proposal presented by Washington to tackle disagreements blocking a deal, they would have to get the agreement and then have to on the implementation details. In other words, how we're going to implement all of this, which is, the devil's in the details always. The U.S. has long said it does not accept a long-term occupation of Gaza by Israel, Blinken stated. The Secretary of State also said that negotiators on the Gaza deal must be given maximum flexibility to reach an agreement. Pressed on Prime Minister Netanyahu's statement that the IDF will not retreat from the Netzarim corridor and the Philadelphia corridor, Blinken replied, the agreement is very clear on the schedule and locations of IDF withdrawals from Gaza, and Israel has agreed to that. That's as much as I know, and that's what I'm clear about. And again, he visited Israel yesterday and met with Netanyahu. He certainly didn't tell Netanyahu this. In a statement to the media, he said Netanyahu does accept the ceasefire deal proposed by the U.S. last week, and now they're waiting to hear from Hamas and get over the finish line. But Hamas senior official Osama Hamdan later criticized Blinken's statement, said it raises many ambiguities because it's not what was presented to us, nor did what we agree on. He added that Hamas has already confirmed to mediators that we don't need new Gaza ceasefire negotiations. We need to agree on an implementation mechanism of an agreement they made with Qatar and Egypt, that is Hamas, without the United States, well, possibly with the United States, but certainly without Israel. And that's what they're talking about. Well, anyway, let's get back to this. The U.S. Doesn't, how does he put this? Won't accept a long-term occupation in Gaza. As Netanyahu made clear, they need to stay there at the Philadelphia corridor. Before, Egypt supposedly was to guard the corridor to make sure nothing came through. And what's happened since 2006? Well, look at what's in these tunnels. They've been brought all kinds of weaponry, all types of materials to build these tunnels, sneaking in people in and out, money and the such like. And so Israel has to stay there. And again, the U.S., again, I always love reading the comments. Basically, they said that, the U.S. is none of their business. Blinken, you're not a friend of us. You're just, you're shelling shield for the Harris administration. You want to be on that. And so you're giving her talking points now, which, believe me, they'd be a lot worse. And, Biden's have been bad, but hers would be a lot worse, as we've talked about. So anyway, we'll see what happens. So it's sad that he makes that statement, sad from the United States of America's perspective, because Israel is our friend and we want them to survive, and they have to survive. And the only way they could survive is have some type of security on all the borders going into Gaza, because we know what goes on there, and that is terrorism. And because the people there, unfortunately, hate Israel, hate the United States for the most part, too. And so we'll see what happens. All right. This next headline is weird. Members of Israel's negotiating team accuse Netanyahu of intentionally sabotaging the hostage deal. This is some report that came out. Sources involved in the ongoing talks for a hostage release ceasefire deal have accused Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of intentionally sabotaging the negotiations, after he was said to have told the Hakish Tikva and Guvaru forums that Israel won't leave the Philadelphia corridor and the Netzarim corridor under any circumstances. That was reported by the Khan broadcasting system. Netanyahu's statement is intended to blow up the negotiations. There's no other way around it, the source tells Khan. The prime minister knows that we are in a critical period during which we're working on solutions for the Philadelphia corridor and Netzarim ahead of the next summit. He knows there is progress, and he puts out statements that are opposite of what was agreed upon with the mediators, the source adds. Now, this is one of these ones you should read the comments about. The comments cannot believe that some mediators actually say that. They're hired to make a deal, but they're not hired to create the points of the deal. And this has been something Netanyahu had said from the beginning. Israel has said from the beginning, we have to make sure that this 8-mile corridor that joins Egypt and Gaza has to be under Israeli control. Otherwise, weapons will come back in. We can start all over again. And before you know it, there'll be, another war. And the same thing with the Netzarim corridor to keep these terrorists from the northern part of Gaza, which had been cleared out for the most part, that are there in the south. And yet these so-called, negotiators are saying, well, he's trying to destroy the negotiation. Well, again, you have, like Netanyahu said yesterday, we have things we stand for and things we will compromise on, and we certainly know the difference. You can't compromise on the security. So you wonder who these people are that are saying this. So anyway, that's the story that came across the wire. And it's sad that Israel has, if this is true, because they have a bunch of liars there in these different media sources for Israel, these newspapers, and now that have the online news, they're all a bunch of leftists, and some of them are real. They hate Netanyahu like the press in the U.S. hates Trump, and it's sad to see that they would seemingly destroy their own country because Netanyahu has these convictions. Anyway, we'll move on to the fourth. And Michael Orin, he's a former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. He said, this is interesting. He said, negotiate hard, watch Sinwar back down. The key question is whether Hamas is genuinely interested in a deal or if it sees a greater advantage in escalating tensions between Israel and Iran, he writes. In the ninth visit to the U.S. To Israel, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken leaves little doubt that the primary, if not sole objective of the United States right now is securing a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of hostages. Blinken is well aware that a retaliatory strike by Iran and Hezbollah against Israel would likely sabotage any chance of reaching such an agreement. As a result, he's calling on all parties to exercise restraint and is working to calm tensions in the region. And Orin writes, however, this approach could lead to the exact opposite outcome of what the Americans and many Israelis hope for, potentially erasing any chance of reaching a deal. At a press conference held Monday night, he updated Netanyahu and said Netanyahu had accepted the American mediation proposal, saying the ball was now in Hamas's court. The pressing question is whether Hamas is even interested in a deal or a further escalation between Israel and Iran better serves its interests, as we talked about this morning. The dilemma stems from Hamas's leader Sinwar's understanding that he cannot achieve his minimum demands in negotiations, namely a permanent ceasefire and the withdrawal of IDF forces. That's not in the cards. They're not going to permanently withdraw their people and do a ceasefire so you can come back and take control. Including the Philadelphia corridor. Without such concessions, Sinwar is unlikely to give up his assets in his possession, of course, which are the hostages for a deal that would allow Israel to restart the war in the future and block the flow of weapons through the corridor. In other words, what motivation does Sinwar have of making a deal? All right, I'll give you the hostages back for what? Some type of ceasefire. But at the end of the day, you're not going to leave Gaza. You're not going to let us be in control. So he doesn't. The only thing he has are the hostages, as like we said, to deal with. The article goes on, it's important to note that both Iranian Mullah regime and the Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah have repeatedly said they would be willing to agree to a ceasefire if Sinwar does. This stance gives the Hamas leader enormous leverage to stay away from the negotiating table and reject any Israeli offer. Thus, the regional war that Sinwar so desires becomes almost inevitable. And that's what we've been saying here. If this is the case, there's only one way to escape this trap. Now, this is interesting what he argues. The United States, having deployed massive naval and air forces to the region, must unequivocally declare its readiness to exact a heavy price from Iran should it or its proxies dare to attack Israel. Iran, which so far has not paid even the smallest price for its ongoing and monstrous aggression in the Middle East, must be convinced that there is no chance of attacking Israel without bringing a severe economic and strategic disaster upon itself. The mullahs must understand that the very existence of the Iranian regime and the fate of its leaders are at stake. Only this way could Sinwar be made to realize that he has no military backing from Iran or Hezbollah, that he will be left to his own devices in a tunnel somewhere underground. Only then will he be willing to agree to a limited ceasefire, allowing Israel the opportunity to prevent Hamas from rearming and reorganizing through the Philadelphia corridor. Only then he will be ready to release a significant number of hostages and agree to a ceasefire that would bring much needed relief to the residents of Israel. Now, here comes the problem, of course. It's hard to believe that this scenario will materialize during the U.S. presidential race, especially with the Democratic National Convention taking place these days. It's clear that most Democratic supporters and even many of its leaders would strongly oppose such a move. Yeah, not only that, your presidential candidate is very much anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian. You want to say also maybe pro-Hamas with what they're doing, certainly not in Israel's favor. So there's no way on earth they would use the military might of the United States to thwart some type of invasion or attack by Iran. Now, what's interesting about this is what we know from the Bible. Eventually, there will come a day is not only the United States will not side with Israel, they will not even be in the picture. And this is why we read in Ezekiel 38, this coming leader called Gog, that's his title. He decides to invade Israel with a number of nations that, including Iran, including Turkey and others. And yet he doesn't give a second thought of the U.S. or anybody coming in to help Israel. No one does. No nation does. And so that tells us at that time, there's not even the pretense of helping Israel. So that's what's coming. That's what's coming from the United States, showing why sign 11 of our 25 signs, the U.S. isn't a player in last days Bible prophecy, because Iran has to give second thoughts now to any type of invasion. But as we get further and further away as a country for our support from Israel is exactly what we're doing. This is what could be the result and what eventually will be the result when we don't know. So it's interesting that, wouldn't it be great if you had a president who said, look, Donald Trump would do that in an instant. If you attempt to attack Israel, we will, turn you into ashes. That's what he said before when Iran was playing around during his presidency. So we will see. We will see. Sadly, that's not going to happen now. Now, headline number 5 is also extremely troubling. Some 135 Hezbollah rockets have been fired into northern Israel since the morning hours today. 5 rockets launched from Lebanon triggered rocket sirens Ya'ara, Adamit, and Advan in the western Galilee Tuesday evening. So still coming this evening. The rockets landed in open areas, causing no injuries. Since this morning, approximately 135 rockets have been fired at northern Israeli communities. In my little app, Red Alert Israel has been going off all day. If you know that, you can get the app for free. You download it, and anytime there's a attack on Israel, missile attack or rocket attack, it goes off. And I always pray for Israel at that time, and that's the idea for it, to let you know what's going on. Anyway, herein lies the immediate problem, namely what to do about Hezbollah. Even if you have an agreement with Hamas, Hezbollah is still there. We saw with their very sophisticated tunnels, their weapons that they have. They're armed much more than Hamas ever has been. They're still under the control of Iran, so they are there always on Israel's northern border, ready to pounce and attack when they decide the time is right. And so Israel's got that. So even if they do get a ceasefire agreement with Hamas, they still have Hezbollah to contend with. So we'll see how all this turns out. Again, it's every day there's something new in there. It gets curiouser and curiouser. And it's sad every day the United States, at least this administration, shows not to be a friend with Israel. All right, I'm Don Stewart again. Thank you so much for watching. We'll keep you posted if something major happens. Of course, we'll do another edition of Breaking News today. Until then, we'll see you first thing in the morning. And then, as always, as we say, very heartfelt feeling for you all. May the Lord richly, richly bless you.